You've likely heard about probiotics, probably taken a probiotic, and also likely heard some conflicting information about probiotics and wondered, are you just wasting your money on them? Which one should you take? How do you take them? When? It's a confusing world out there. And so today on the podcast, I have Dr. Oscar Coetzee, who's from the team for clinical education and functional nutrition at Designs for Health. And we dig into the wild world of probiotics and the gut microbiome. And he breaks it down in such a beautiful way to really make it understandable and highlights why our good bacteria, those probiotics, those keystone bacteria, are so incredibly important to work together as a team to support your body and to really create balance and resilience in your gut so that the rest of your body can work even better. Feel free to reach out if you have questions. We do talk about gut testing and, the Designs for Health brand. If you have questions about these things, feel free to reach out. I love to support my patients with these and happy to help put you in the right direction on these as well. Dr. Oscar, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Naylor.
So first I'd love, I like to start with your story, and I'd love to hear kind of what brought you into this world of the microbiome and probiotics.
Wow. Yeah, that's a long one. Actually, I started my career out in the field of mental health. So I actually have a, background in psychology. That's what my graduate degrees were in before. And I was doing my internship at Fair Oaks Hospital in Summit, New Jersey, and there was a psychiatrist there by the name of Dr. Mark Gold. And he was the guy that kind of planted the seed for me, into mental health and nutrition as a start. And then that obviously always is going to have an association to the microbiome from what we're eating and how that's feeding our bacteria. And that just kind of set me on a pathway. A couple of years later, it wasn't immediate because I wanted to pursue my PhD in psychology. And then my mom got sick, and, kind of the way we all get into the, functional medical field is through a friend or a family member or whatever. And, it kind of just triggered back in my memory to like, wait a minute, there is something here. And then I kind of went down that route, and then clearly the microbiome became a big part of it. And, as a professional, I've been in clinical practice for probably 20 odd years. I've been a professor at some institutions teaching functional nutrition and functional testing. And clearly the microbiome is just such a big component of the testing side of it. And, then I eventually got hired by Designs for Health to head up their education team and, just keep digging like it never ends, right? It's always a pursuit of new knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah. My medical school, they always talked about lifelong learners.
Yeah.
And now I kind of laugh at it because it's so true. Some of us are just
Totally.
wired that way where we, see a problem. We have that family member who gets ill and we're just like, wait a second, what's behind this?
Correct.
And I love that.
Mhm.
You can really take that kind of experience and then dive so deep into help so many people.
Yeah, and for me
Amazing.
also clinically, I feel that I've adapted so much, in 20 years. Things that I did 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't do anymore, from a nutraceutical standpoint or from a protocol recommendation standpoint. Things have changed so much that, not that we didn't have success in the past with, those modalities, but there's just so many more things that are coming to light now that really has put a big light on the path forward.
Yeah, and that takes some bravery, in my opinion, to
Yeah.
continue to change what you do and not get stuck in, oh, well, this is how we do it.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah,
having
exactly.
the humbleness to be able to say, okay, what I did was good, but it could be better. We could do things differently.
And I
I
think
love
it's
that.
probably, as you would also agree with your patient base, is, people don't come to us with a one-sided problem, right? I mean, the things are so in depth. There's psychological overlap, there's gut problems, there's hormonal fluctuation issues, there's blood sugar dysregulation. I know that they all intertwine, but just so many components to cases that, as as a DO, it's, you got to take those things apart in a very broad picture, and then depending on what the condition is, you have these processes that you need to go through for 6 months to a year before you can even, get to really help those people, optimize their health.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to kind of dive us into the topic, I feel like the biggest entry point that I hear people asking about is probiotics, where, they think they should be on a probiotic, they're taking something, and they've probably heard so many conflicting things about probiotics and prebiotics now. I'd love for you to just start off say, like, where is maybe there a gap or downfall in the typical probiotics and prebiotics that we're seeing?
Well, I think the biggest downfall, if you can call it a downfall from general probiotics, is that they transient, right? So they don't really repopulate the gut the way that we at first thought that they would. If you're taking a bunch of standard probiotics, they don't really go in there and regrow the microbiome, right? They really help when they're present. So the scientific literature is very strong on the effectiveness of probiotics, but not so much if you stop taking them, right? So you kind of have to keep taking the probiotic to have the result. And there's nothing wrong with that because, in my area that overlaps the, functional health to the mental health, it's important sometimes for people just to have some bacteria that can help the mental status or the production of certain things that can convert to neurotransmitters. But the problem has always been that they're pretty transient, right? So they will work as long as you're taking them. The other side of the coin is, to keep the microbiome alive that we have and functioning that we have, you have to take these prebiotics that you're talking about, fibers and polyphenols and resistant starches and all that kind of stuff. And that helps, but depends how diminished or compromised your gut is. It doesn't help getting fertilizer for 2 acres when you only have one seed, that's there
Mm.
to grow. So you have to kind of pick your poisons when it comes to the prebiotics. And sometimes when you give people a lot of prebiotics, they have a lot of symptoms because they really don't have enough substantive microbes in the gut to really handle that level of influx. So what I'm trying to say is that, if you have a really compromised gut, and theoretically, yes, prebiotics really are the secret to rejuvenating the gut, but you can't do it overnight if there's nothing there, right? And your side effects will be a lot greater. And then, there's another component. So I want to differentiate between bacteria and microbes in the gut. So I want to look at the probiotics that everybody is familiar with, like Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus. And then I want to really talk a little bit more about some of the keystone microbes that we have in
Mhm.
our guts. So, keystone bacteria, for the listeners, it's just as the word says, there's a keystone. If you have an arch and there's a stone in the middle of that arch and you remove that stone, then the whole arch collapses. So look at the other strains of bacteria that we have as kind of the arch, but the keystone microbes are the stone, right? So we need to have that stone in place to keep the arch solidified. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing clinically is that a lot of people are lacking these particular strains. And maybe some of the listeners would be very familiar with a bacteria called Akkermansia, which has been spoken about a lot. There's several keystone commensal strains, but I'll probably talk about 3 or 4 of them today. The other one is a very complicated word. It's called Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. We'll just call it FPRAU, for the discussion today. Beria and some of the Anaerostipes bacteria. So what I want people to understand is don't try and remember all those complicated versions of them. Just think of these microbes as almost like an accessory organ system. So they're not just a bunch of bacteria that's coming through your gut. They're literally in your gut, communicating with the cells in your gut lining to express your immune system, to drive hormonal function, to make new cells, to create an environment in the gut, to be hospitable for all the good guys to be there. And that's why I think these microbes are so important to understand. So what we have seen now clinically and through new evolution and probiotic development, these probiotics, by the way, are what we call anaerobic. So they don't like oxygen. They don't want to live in an oxygenated environment. And up until this point, there hasn't been the ability to really take these probiotics and put them in a capsule because they're anaerobic. But that technology is now existing and they're able to do that. And before we go any further, I want to do a further differentiation. So these kinds of probiotics that we're talking about that are these keystones, and if you're low in them, it's best when those probiotics or bacteria come from a human donor, not from, something that is fermented with dairy or fermented food. So because of the intellectual capacity of those microbes to your system. So it's impossible to get FPROW from fermented vegetables, right? But what the fermented vegetables give us is the food that feeds this particular strain. And what we've seen and why people are so low in these strains is antibiotic use long term, stomach acid medications like proton pump inhibitors, long term exposure to glyphosate and herbicides and pesticides, alcohol, not very diverse diets. Even if people are on a FODMAPs diet to improve symptoms, they're really not helping the regrowth of the species because there isn't enough diversity, lack of fiber intake. So all the things that we're all exposed to 24/7. And this is why we see the patterns today that most people are actually low in them. And we are not innately designed to be low in them because they literally kind of a communication system, from the food sources to the gut lining to our system. So I'm going to stop there if you have to throw in some questions there because I've gone a little extensive.
No, that was amazing. And I love the way that you describe that ecosystem working together because I think that's a lot of people don't think about. They think, oh, there's some bacteria hanging out in my gut and they're important, but they don't really think about why and how they have such an impact, not only with our body, but also with each other. And so if
Yeah,
one is missing, then the other one struggles. And it really is so much more complex than people think of, right? Yeah, like just the fiber. And I love how you described that fertilizer versus seed
yeah,
scenario. That's really
mm,
easy to be able to visualize. And while it is complex, I feel like it's also, there can be simplicity in it too. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. Like you said, you don't have to know all of these things. It's sort of knowing those bottom lines of, okay, how do we actually support it then? Which I think is very important because I agree with you. I mean, from my clinical insight too, I have so many patients that are low in these keystone bacteria that in the past we didn't really have as many tools as we do now to support
correct.
them. So it's also a very, wonderful place to be right now.
And you bring up something really interesting. The simplicity of this is the fact that these microbes are so intellectual and so smart as a community that we don't have to worry about exactly why they do what they do. And this is what I would like listeners to understand is we've been trying to understand, and I know that you do, some GI map testing, and I'm not specifically saying that we're talking about that form of testing. I could care less what you do as long as you look at the microbes. And it's quite amazing to me to see the compensation. Originally when I started as a practitioner and I saw opportunistic and pathogenic bacteria, my first thought is antimicrobial, antibiotic or whatever, because that's kind of what we did.
Mm.
So when we set out and started to use these anaerobic strains of bacteria, initially all we wanted to see is that they are moving Akkermansia and they are moving F. brown, they are moving these things, because we know how important those bacteria are. But what we learned in addition to that was kind of eye-opening. So not very large population study, but about 20 to 25 people with very compromised gut, low anaerobic strains of bacteria. And as well as I do, no stool test is ever going to look the same. But in those categories, they were the same. So some had, one even had a C. diff overgrowth, one had, opportunistic overgrowth, one had an autoimmune overgrowth. And what we started to see was that those also came down. So it wasn't like we set out to do that, right? We wanted to just see how it moves the needle. And for the listeners to try and explain that. So bad bacteria, as people would call them, or sometimes opportunist, which means that they could be good or bad, when they're in overgrowth, most of them like oxygen, right? So if you don't have a lot of bacteria that produce low oxygen, then clearly you're going to give them the environment where they want to grow. Now you bring in bacteria that creates this deoxygenated environment. So what you're physically doing is you're suffocating those bacteria to death without having to bring in an antimicrobial. Now, I'm not saying we don't have to use them, right? I'm just saying for the baseline patient, when they have these overgrowth of opportunistic, that's what I was meaning earlier, that my mind is now completely shifted. The first entry point for me now as a clinician, I'm going to give you these anaerobic strains, send them into your gut, make sure that you eat enough of those prebiotics and probiotics so that they can engraft and grow, because these actually grow. They don't just go through your body.
Oh.
And when they're there, let them fight it out, right? Because their level of intelligence is absolutely incredible. And I want the listeners to understand this one story. So sometimes what you see is when one of these anaerobes are low, one of these keystones are low, and the other one is high, that could just mean that that one is working harder to try and bring those others back to life because it's
Ooh.
creating more hypoxia or it's creating more short chain fatty acids or byproducts or food for the other ones to eat. So we've seen also not only the low numbers normalize, we've also seen that the high numbers that you sometimes see has become to normalize. So that just shows me that the compensation, because you're giving them more workers, is valuable. So again, for the listeners, understand the logic or the baseline of this. So pretend your gut is a factory, and in your factory you have 50 employees, right? And they are unbelievable workers. They never fight. It's perfect world. They do their job. It's great. Now all of a sudden, 20 of them call in sick. Now the other 30 is doing the work of the other 50. And they're going to keep doing it as long as they possibly can because that's just what they innately designed to do. Until you bring that other 20 back, that other 30 is going to do whatever they have to do to make sure that those other 20 come back. That's the beauty about the microbiome. Those bacteria never wake up one morning and say, hey, Miranda, I don't want to go to work. I'm lazy. I'm sick. I'm tired. They want to get up every day. They want to produce what they need to produce so that they can keep you happy and themselves happy. And that's the beautiful thing about the microbiome is they never want a day off. All they want is enough co-workers not to, add the amount of stress to the system the way we do.
I love that visual. Again, that's so helpful, I think, to understand that. And I think that's such a good emphasis that it's not like you discussed a little bit of the battle, right, between some of the good guys and the bad
Yeah.
guys, but it's also this synergistic environment that they're trying to support each other, especially the good guys. They're in there trying to support each other and your body because it works for everyone. It's just all mutually beneficial. So that really, highlights the importance of then having that community there.
Yeah, and the thing that you say about competition, I want people to understand the importance of this. You do not really want a body that doesn't have competition. You don't want to just have all good guys because
Hmm.
imagine if you have an environment where you have a whole police force, but there's no crime. I know everybody wants that, but what are the police going to do? Then they become kind of not part of the game plan, right? So, and the other analogy that you can use is when you're working out, right? And you doing something for osteoporosis prevention or whatever. You need to put a weight in your hand to strain the muscle and the body to strengthen the whole thing. So you have resistance. And that resistance is part of the growth, right? And that's the same in the microbiome. You never want to have a gut that's completely sterile of all opportunistic bacteria because that's also not a good indicator. So look at them more as kind of once you have those guys there, they would know exactly what the limit would be of what those opportunistic bacteria need to be, but they also want them there because those opportunistic bacteria provide them with things that feed them. So I
Hmm.
think this competitive state is an important thing to do, and nobody can strive for this perfectly healthy gut, right? Because we just have too many variables involved. And it's interesting because if you look at ancestral hypothetical research, right? Let's say 500, 600 years ago, I believe the average person was eating between 100 and 150 different kinds of foods, where we're eating about 15 to 20 now. So a lot of diversity. The average fiber intake was about, they postulate between 80 to 150 grams. That's a lot of fiber compared to what we're eating now at 16 to, right?
Hmm.
So all these little nuances that you're seeing in our microbiomes and ancestrally where we were and where we are today should explain to you why, you know, we have an issue. And if we go back even more, you will see that those people had worms, right? Not necessarily parasitical stuff, but they had worms. And the worms had them, more competitive with the other strains of bacteria. And if you go to communities where they have worms, and I don't want you to think that I'm trying to promote worms now, but those people don't have eczema. Those people don't have autoimmune diseases. There's reasons that the gut needs competition to be healthy. That's why I'm really open as a human to, you know, be careful of being too sterile, right?
Hmm.
You need having a dog in a house is never a bad thing, right? It really helps the microbiome to rejuvenate. So just keep in mind that bad is not always bad.
I couldn't agree more. And it's that conversation of like, washing your produce and like eating a little bit of dirt on purpose. I mean, it's so hard because nowadays, like you mentioned, the pesticides
Yeah.
and chemicals that like I don't think in any scenario those things are good for us. But
No.
the dirt, the soil, the environmental things, like you pointed out, those are what we evolved in. And so our
Right.
bodies are created to be challenged by those. So yeah, being too sterile, especially for our kids, for our families, we tend
Yes,
to
mistake.
probably over sterilize nowadays that it
Yeah.
actually can
Yeah.
be harmful. So
Yeah, I
I
come from
appreciate you pointing that
Africa,
out.
originally, and I can remember as a kid, you go to the backyard, you pull out a carrot and you just rub it down, you chew on the carrot, you can taste the sand right in
Mhm.
there, and then you play with a dog and you stick your finger in your mouth. It's a part of life, and I
Mhm.
think really what gives you now that's not going to give you the keystone commensal bacteria necessarily, but it certainly gives you the weight or the training for the other ones to be competitive.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Earlier you mentioned Akkermansia, and I did want to touch on that because it's a popular one because,
Yeah.
more recently that was one of the ones that could be taken as a probiotic, but in my clinical practice it was exciting and then a little bit not disappointing, but like kind of gave us some questions of, oh, is this really doing what it's meant to do? And I'd love your take on that of is it actually effective to just supplement with like just one like Akkermansia?
Yeah, that's a good question, but a little double-sided, and I'll try and answer it from both perspectives. So
Hmm.
depends what kind of Akkermansia too, right? Whether you have pasteurized or live. That's as a start a very important differentiator. We believe that the live versions are the better ones. So I know that a couple of practitioners that I've spoken about have said that they've used Akkermansia, and the Akkermansia doesn't move on the test, the following time that they do that. I will
Hmm.
tell you that we've had clinically statistical significance in movement of Akkermansia, but I do believe it's better in a community, right? So let's just talk about Akkermansia. So Akkermansia, for the listeners, is a very, very important keystone bacteria that is really involved with the body's natural production of GLP-1. And I'm sure that everybody is familiar with the GLP-1 story, right? So basically, Akkermansia produces a short chain fatty acid called acetate and propionate, and then that triggers some mechanisms on the layers of the gut lining that helps us to produce GLP-1s. So, not surprising that if you see people with metabolic syndrome, weight loss resistance, some obesity, to see them classically low in Akkermansia, right? Because you have this natural GLP-1 producing agent that you low in. In addition to that, Akkermansia has all sorts of associations to many, many pathways, and it actually helps us to make new goblet cells, and these goblet cells produce mucin that feeds the Akkermansia. So you literally have a bacteria in your gut that is telling your cells to store more mucin so it can eat more, so it can feed you more. I mean, it's a beautiful relationship, right? If you have it. So Akkermansia being low is literally a metabolic indicator of a problem. You are at bigger risk of type 2 diabetes. You're at bigger risk of metabolic criteria. They even now have tied some non-alcoholic fatty liver associations to low Akkermansia. Now, am I saying that low Akkermansia is the cause of that? No, I'm saying that low Akkermansia is associated to those conditions. Clearly, your diet and lifestyle has a lot to do with what you're doing, but maybe the diet and lifestyle is causing the low Akkermansia. We don't really know at this point, but Akkermansia is a really, really important one. So as a company, ironically, we do have an isolated Akkermansia one, but we really promote that one specifically to the GLP-1 concept, right? Because we've combined it with another postbiotic that has been clinically shown to help having a similar kind of outcome to a GLP-1 for those people coming off a GLP-1, don't want to go on a GLP-1. I don't get involved with that argument. Wherever you want to fit in, I'll assist you. So that's when that one is really good. I will tell you that in the clinical trials, when we use the Akkermansia combined in the same product with the other species, it seems to be better because it's coming with a package. It's coming with its friends. It's not lonely, and when it gets down there, it's happier to work together. So it's too early to say because we've not done a trial yet on Akkermansia by itself and Akkermansia with the other strains.
Hmm.
But I can tell you, I wouldn't be surprised if the Akkermansia with the other strains outperform the other Akkermansia. And this is just me being an outside, non-scientific statement at this point. But yes, I feel that Akkermansia can move if it's the right kind, if it is taken with the right prebiotics over time. You can definitely have positive outcomes from Akkermansia. Remember, these microbes, when you put them down there in your gut, they want to be there. It's like you're giving them a new home. Like, awesome. I get an apartment, I get a car, I get everything, and all I have to do is do what? Produce some stuff for you. I'm in. Like they want to be there. So if you can help them stay there, you're gonna have a really, really positive and cohesive. I don't know if I'm answering your question there, but basically, yeah, that's my
Yeah,
point on it.
absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciate you giving that nuance of the type matters,
Yeah,
in what combination could even be better. And I think that is really, again, very exciting that we have these tools now where if we are in that situation where, maybe the prebiotics aren't enough
yeah,
to reestablish those colonies, that we have these tools to do it in a really supportive way. So,
yeah.
and I appreciate you explaining kind of the importance too, again, of these, like, they're feeding the gut cells too in a way that are also going to feed them, and, highlighting again that importance with how it works with our body.
Yeah, I've never seen any species on the planet that is less selfish than a microbe that is there to help you. Like they literally are the hardest working things I've ever seen, and they don't ask anything in return other than just the most basic thing is make sure that you don't take too much alcohol, make sure that you eat a little bit more fiber, and I'll do whatever you want to, but just give me these real basic things that I need to perform. And we're just at the entry point of understanding all this stuff, Miranda. I mean, we've got these strains that we've now looked at clinically, crowd out opportunistic bacteria. It even helps to bring down a little bit of that really hardcore C. diff patient. Not saying it's curing it, but it's moving the needle on that. It's improving tight junction and zonulin for the listeners. That's your leaky gut story, right? You've heard of that. So it helps to eradicate the leaky gut thing when you have these microbes present. And in addition to that, certain strains of these microbes are directly connected to Crohn's disease, colorectal cancers, major depressive disorder. You can look at studies. If you extract one of these microbes and just go put it in PubMed or Google or whatever, it's going to come up and say, have you low in this? These are generally, the patterns that we're seeing. So I think as a species and as a human race, we need to, as a priority, say, I got to get these microbes in my gut, and I have to go to a Dr. Naylor kind of functional practitioner to say, hey, can you test my functional gut test? Because a traditional parasitical analysis in a gastrointestinal office is not going to do the job because they're not looking at optimization and balance. It's more disease specific, right? And you can be void of disease symptomology with having low numbers of these to a certain point. There is a certain point where this is going to go. And I think in the future, what we're going to learn as professionals is this is probably going to be our major indicator of what's coming. If we know what all these microbes are associated with chronic diseases. So for all the listeners, if there's one thing I can tell you, and if you spend $300 or whatever it is on a functional stool test, 5 or 10 Starbucks coffees, right? I mean, it's literally worth it to do that once a year just so that you know where you stand on these microbes, because without them, you have a problem.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And that's why in my practice, again, I've gone to the place of really recommending it to pretty much every single person that I see,
You have
because
to.
one person could look or feel fine. They don't have any very obvious symptoms, but there could be an issue. And you led perfectly. That was going to be my next question for someone who's listening, who's like, ooh, this sounds really important. Are there some early warning signs they should watch out for? Is there a certain time where they should absolutely look into this?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see a correlation starting to show up between low Akkermansia, for instance, in your fasting glucose, right? Or your
Mm.
hemoglobin A1C. So these markers that show early stage indicators of pre-diabetes, they will not be perfect when your Akkermansia is dead low. And as you know, Miranda, sometimes that could be 7 to 8 to 9 years before manifesting into a disease. But the absence of disease isn't health, right?
Mhm.
Especially when it comes to the microbiome. the microbiome is really something that would steal from Peter to pay Paul for a very long time. And then at some point, it's just a collapse. So if you have multifactorial things starting to build up in your life, you're more anxious than you used to be, you may be more depressed than you used to be, even though you feel that, you really don't have the major reasons for depression. Your digestion is a little off, you're a little constipated, and then you have diarrhea every now and then. You sometimes feel a little lightheaded or dizzy or hangry when you don't eat. So all underlining indicators that the microbiome is not optimal, right? Because honestly, as a healthy individual, you should be able to eat anything without feeling bloated. Now, I'm even saying, by the off chance, which I don't support, okay, because I'm not a fast food person, but even if you go and eat a crappy burger, your gut shouldn't have 6-month pregnant distension because you just ate a crappy burger. You should have enough stomach acid in your body to kind of dilute all that. You should have enough microbes that can break down and probably roll their eyes and say, hey, thank you, Oscar, for giving me this rubbish. I prefer fiber, but hey, if you want to give me bread carbs, I'm going to use it to do what I need to do. But it's really, really, really important to take that into consideration. So I think a lot of people think that they're improving their health because they're not eating something, and then they're not bloated. And then they say, well, I'm not bloated anymore. Oh, so I must be fixed. No, actually, you're making the condition worse, because now you're going to the next 2 years, you're going to have to be able to cut that down even more, because what you're eating now at some point is going to become reactive to your body as well, right? From a food intolerance standpoint. So it's a never ending story. And this is why, and this is, honestly, again, this is where 10, 15 years ago, I was as guilty as the next guy. You came to my office, you had small intestinal bowel overgrowth, I give you a FODMAPs diet, you have your life back. But that didn't cure anything, right? I mean, that just improved your symptomology. Now I understand that, hey, I don't have success with you as a patient until I can have you eat 85% of your diet really healthy to feed the microbiome. The other 15%, I don't care what you do, but in neither of those cases should you feel bloated, distended, and superbly constipated. So I think
Mhm.
that, to me, is the clearest indicator of optimal health, is how well can your body tolerate. Now, a lot of people would come to me and say, listen, I can eat junk food all day and have nothing. I said, no, no, no. I said 85% healthy food, so I'm going to have to give you 50 to 80 grams of fiber. If you can tolerate that, and you can tolerate the crappy food without anything showing up, your gut's in a good place.
I appreciate you sharing that, because it's something that we see. I think even more so maybe in the person who is trying to eat healthy. It's this mindset of restriction.
Yeah.
We need to avoid these bad foods, like you said, and we're already with so much less diversity than our ancestors had. And now it's like, well, I'm eating two foods basically. And that gets really
Yeah.
scary. Yeah. So I
I,
appreciate
I
you
don't,
saying
I
that.
don't know anybody that through this elimination process, they went from gluten-free, dairy-free, and then they go to paleo, anti-inflammatory, whatever it is. And there's places for those diets initially for symptom improvement. I'm all for it. But at some point, when you're working with a professional, they need to be reintroducing to
Hmm.
see and testing you. It's the same thing as, hey, I'm working out with a 5-pound weight. Oh, okay, I can do 6,000 curls with a 5-pound weight. I can't, but I'm just saying. So imagine if you then give me a 20-pound weight. Now all of a sudden now I can feel the difference. That's what you need to do. You always need to be able to test the body with a little bit more. But the key component to that is, as much as you are willing to eat a little bit of junky food, you must be willing to eat the good foods at a higher level of fiber and polyphenols without side effects. And I think that's a really important point for people to understand, is because I'm a practitioner like you, I know my patients aren't the most compliant individuals in the world, and I don't want to take away from them that they're going to go on their boat and drink a couple of beers and eat a burger, or July 4th, they're going to eat a hot dog with horrible mustard, or whatever the case may be. I just try and get them at 85% so that the body is really good at, handling those couple of times that it isn't great. And do I believe that you have to be 100% optimal in your food intake to be optimally healthy? No, because the body is pretty resilient. If you see what we've done to our society and our foods, and and we're still walking around. That's pretty impressive, right? I mean, I know people that eat only processed foods. They still get up in the morning. They still go around their business. They clearly have all sorts of side effects from that, but they're not dead, so the body can take a lot of beating, and it can take more beating if you give it the right microbiome.
Yeah. I love that. And I use the word resilience all the time, especially talking with my patients, is that the goal isn't just being symptom free and living within a tiny, tiny parameter
Exactly.
that you can't eat out and you can't eat this and that. I love that you described that. Yes, let's primarily eat the good whole foods that are going to
Yeah.
give us what our body needs. Of course, we can't go without that, but also have some flexibility where you can live your life. You can go out and eat and enjoy, have a glass of wine at a
Yeah.
special event and not feel like you're going to be dead the next day from it. So
It's
I think that's really the
exactly,
goal.
and I understand. Look, I mean, I understand the work of Dr. Fasano with alpha gliadin and gluten. And yeah, totally. There are people that just can't tolerate it. But as a general rule, the reason that people can't tolerate that, unless they're celiac, is a compromised gut. The gut just doesn't, your gut can only do a 5 pound weight. The gut cannot do a 20 pound weight. You got to get your gut to be able to do a 20 and a 40 pound weight. That's what you got to be able to do before your gut is completely resilient.
And with that, I mean, you described how these beneficial bacteria go so far in being able to create balance with opportunistic bacteria, maybe, get rid of some of the pathogens or at least,
Yeah.
suppress
Yeah.
them and do some healing with the gut. But how far could that potentially go? Could someone just take a probiotic potentially and have all of it healed? Or do you see a place for some of the like gut healing products, for example, or the anti-inflammatory type things?
Oh,
Like,
I see a place for both. But in
mhm.
answer to your question, um, if I look at the amount of people, and by the way, for you that you run stool tests, I'll give you the data on that, right? So all the stool tests that you've run, we actually reached out to a couple of labs and looked at the statistical data, looked at 17,000 tests. And in 17,000 tests, 65% of the people that tested were low in one or all three of these anaerobes. So it's a community thing, right? And in order for us to improve that, you might need to take the actual probiotic that puts it back in your body. Like you are without the seeds at the moment. If you're in that 65% category, you're without the seed. And anything that you do on the outside is just fertilizer. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to put fertilizer on a piece of ground that has no seeds. It doesn't matter, right? It's not going to give you what you want. So it's really important to get these seeds back into your body, and they will figure it out, right? If you're there and then you start giving them a little bit of assistance with prebiotics, and you don't have to be perfect, but you just have to kind of start changing a little, you will see what they'll do for you. They will literally take hold, they'll start growing, and they will start handling some of these pathogens in a systemic way, from the gut standpoint. And I just want the listeners to also understand one other thing. If you look at a field that maybe was hurt by herbicides or pesticides, and it kind of looks barren, right? The first thing that always comes up is a weed, right? So a weed is going to start growing. So to me, weeds are opportunistic bacteria. They're not bad inherently because they are producing some things to put it back into the soil to make the soil better. So the weeds are actually the first sign of healing if you really want to analyze it. So let's pretend that you have a gut that's low in these commensal, full of opportunists. Those opportunists are just growing more, one, because there's too much oxygen. And two, they're trying to probably produce byproducts to help those other guys come back because those opportunists don't necessarily not want to have Akkermansia present, right? So basically, the way I look at it is if you go in there and kill all the weeds, then you've killed all the assistants. So
Mm.
when I look at a stool test now, I don't look at all the opportunists as like, oh my God, look at your opportunistic overgrowth. You have Klebsiella, Morganella, Pseudomonas, and then you get the person's eyes to be that big because they think they're dying. Now I'm telling them, hey, you just have a lot of weeds in the field. Let's get the good guys to crowd out the weeds and we're good to go. And we're not going to be overtly super concerned with just the weeds because they really trying to help you. Because remember, those opportunists also want to survive, right? In their own way. but the competition element is just not there. And when
Mm,
you provide that, so in answer to your question, I feel that everybody that lives a moderately modern lifestyle, which would be, antibiotic use recently, which most people do, stomach acid medication, couple of drinks, smoke, social, you probably just need to take it. Do I think there's anything bad that can happen to a person that has them in optimal levels? No, not at all. We've not seen that if you give these strains to a person that has enough, that they go too high. It's almost like they self-regulate,
mhm,
at some point. But what I do believe is if you take them for 3 to 4 months and you do the right things, they will engraft, and then you don't have to take them all the time anymore. You
mm,
might want to take them more when you're not being so good, or you might want to take them once a year when they come and see you to do their stool test and see, hey, you probably need another 2 months. For me personally, I use them now like once every quarter. So I'll just do a sleeve of them in February, then I won't do them until April again, unless I have to go on an antibiotic or some other, medical treatment, then I would up them again. But I don't think there's anybody that won't benefit from them. It's almost like saying to me that, we all going to live without our toes, right? These are like toes. They're part of you. They have a purpose. Bring them
mhm.
in. Not going to hurt.
Yeah, and that approach sounds very realistic, again, especially since we highlighted how our modern life is so different
Yeah.
and not nearly as supportive as it should be for microbiome, that just having that maintenance for it
Mhm.
sounds very it sounds common sense and really realistic.
Yeah. No, 100%. Yeah. So, I mean, again, how compromised are you is how long you're going to be on it. All I can say to you, if you're a human, if you're from this planet and you put those things in your gut, they want to be there. So it's not like I'm giving you something that the body wants to reject. Okay. It's not like sometimes you take something and the body has a adverse reaction to it because it doesn't want it. The only adverse reaction that you might have from these things is they start to populate, and yeah, they kill things. So there's die off, and the die off creates some symptomology. But if you're working with a proper clinician, they'll explain to you that that's part of, hey, we got to get some of these weeds out of there. So there's going to be rubble. You have to be able to understand that, and you can back off. You don't have to take these things on a daily basis for them to work. Sometimes I do it once every second day for people that have a slight reaction, but you need them back in your body at some point.
Well, this has been so helpful and really so fascinating. I think you've really provided, again, some incredible visuals for people to really understand what this all means. With that, is there maybe like a final kind of like myth that you'd like to debunk that we haven't touched on yet about our gut health?
Yeah, I guess the modern myth today would be that you can repair your gut health just with eating real food. I,
Mm,
I, I just don't think that's true anymore. And I was one of those people who's like, hey, I eat enough fiber, I do enough this. Yeah, I was surprised, when I ran my own test that I was low in FPRO. Like, how am I
mm.
low in FPRO if I'm doing all these other things and I'm living 90%, realistic organic? How is that even possible? And then you start realizing, well, because I live next door to a person that sprays his lawn with herbicide. And I'm going to go out to a restaurant and not care whether something is organic or not. That's just me. And I'm going to eat something that's probably affecting it. So I just think that it's impossible today to optimize a human gut just on food. Once they're established, yes. But if you're low, I don't see how that's working. I haven't seen it clinically. I have not seen clinically that a person is low in those keystone strains. I give them, because I've done that, polyphenols, diet changes, lots of fiber. I don't see those things moving. Whereas now I've I've seen them moving. So it's almost like we're putting an evolutionary product back into our body, right?
Hmm.
That we've been void of for a while.
Yeah, amazing. Well, where can people find you to learn more? Maybe like see some of this research that you've been doing, which sounds so fascinating.
Yeah, so the easiest way to do it is that they can go to designsforhealth.com, right? And if they go on there and they literally put in the word complete commensal, there's going to be all sorts of information there for them. People can purchase it from there. My recommendation is always to connect with a practitioner like you, do a stool test, determine where you are, look at the symptomology, and go from there. We also on the website have some downloadable patient ed sheets. So like, the listeners can literally read in a more simplistic understanding, why and when this is. And you can find me on there. Like literally you can go to the education team and you will be able to find my name and an email there. So it's basically first initial last name at designsforhealth.com. And if you have any questions, yeah, shoot them my way. I'm clearly very passionate about this discovery. And I have never been a clinician that has bought into this is the answer to every problem on the planet. But I will say that if I only had one bullet in my life to fire right now to help a person with chronic disease, it would be this one because
Mhm.
I know the tentacles that it can provide because it's not just these 5 or 6 strains of bacteria. It's literally what they do as a team.
Mhm.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
85% of your metabolic and immune function is connected to these strains of bacteria. So that's a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah. Very strong statement. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I appreciate all the, education information that you provide as a company. And I really appreciate you sharing that today with the listener as well.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
If you've been listening to this episode and nodding along and resonated with some of the symptoms we've talked about, or you're just recognizing that you feel really off in your body, I want you to know this. The fact that you're having symptoms, feeling not right, and no one has identified that yet for you, does not mean it doesn't exist or that it's in your head. That just means that someone hasn't taken the right approach and identified the root cause yet for you. That's exactly why I designed my Optimal Wellness program. It's for the woman just like you. It's not another protocol that you have to white knuckle through, change your life, and completely overhaul things in a very stressful way. It's just you and me sitting down and figuring out what is driving your symptoms, what's getting in the way of you feeling your best, and addressing that step by step over 6 months. If this sounds like the kind of care you've been looking for, the best next step is to book a clarity call with me. You can do that on my website at drmirandanayler.com/schedule-now. Again, that's drmirandanayler.com/schedule-now. That's also linked in the show notes. And you can just book a slot with me and we'll just sit down and have a conversation about what you've been experiencing and how I might be able to help. I promise, no pitch, no pressure. It's just a really nice conversation between you and me to connect and see if it feels like a good fit.